Should Christians invest more time building the church/the Christian community, or should they invest more time building their city? Growing up, I didn't see much beyond trying to save people, trying to be saved and to save people. And for me, there was no better place to do that and to help other people do that than things that were related to the church or nonprofits. And I don't know if you're in a similar place. If you don't know what it's like to bridge the rest of your life and your work and spiritual and faith life together. If you don't know what it means to be a Christian as a financial advisor or a software developer or a construction worker, besides perhaps not swearing, maybe not drinking, not using God's name in vain, and things like that. I'm still learning what it's like to bridge my faith and work together. At the same time, I've been investigating this for the last 5 years, this specific topic, and I wanted to share some things I've learned along the way. The first things that I learned about this work and faith divide, of perhaps the church and the city divide, is that we often forget the very first commission, the mandate that God gave to humanity. And the first command was not to avoid eating the fruit of the tree of it, was not avoiding an apple. Rather, it was a command to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth, and to rule over it. And I've been spending a lot of time figuring out what exactly that means today. Something began to click though at InterVarsity's work of theology of work retreat. They talked about being exiles and treating our time here on earth as those who were in exile in a country that was not their own. And they pointed first to Jeremiah 29. Now that might sound familiar because it contains the famous verse, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future." I heard that a lot growing up. I heard that a lot during my graduation from high school. But what I did not know was that the plans that the Lord mentions is not something that I need to necessarily discover or wait for God to show to me. Rather, those plans are 7 verses before that verse. So that's verse 11. And if you read verse 4 to 9, it will tell of the plans that God has for us to prosper us and not to harm us, or to seek for our prosperity, for our shalom. And the plan, surprise, surprise, was very like the first command, the mandate in Genesis 1. It says, "Be fruitful." Jeremiah writes, "Build houses and live in them, plant vineyards and eat of their fruit." He says, "Increase in number." In Genesis 1, Jeremiah says, "Marry and be married, increase in number and do not decrease." And it says, "Fill the earth and rule over it." And Jeremiah says, "Seek the good, the prosperity, the shalom of the city. For in the city's prosperity, or shalom, you will find your own prosperity." That's shalom. And the idea there is kings and queens, they are the ones who take ownership of the city, who seek its good, even at potentially their own sacrifice. And they know that if their city thrives, they too will thrive. And so what are these plans to prosper us? They are the plans to build houses. I would like to include build businesses, plant vineyards, that's number one. Marry, be married, increase in number. Bring people into Christianity, introduce them to Jesus Christ. That's number two, increase in number, do not decrease. And number three, to seek the good of the city, to rule not as with power and human authority, but rather from a servant-like heart that we see later in Jesus Christ. And you might be like, Nathan, that's all great. It's good to know that that verse actually had a deeper meaning besides some wow wishes. But we're not living in the Old Testament anymore. We're not in Babylon. And I would actually argue that we might be. If you look at 1 Peter 1, Peter opens his book saying, or his letter saying, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the exiles in the dispersion. Peter then continues on his letter and tells them how to conduct themselves honorably as holy priests. But then he says something very interesting. He says, royal priests. Live as royal priests. I want to focus on the word royalty. That the early church was called to live as royalty in the cities where they were, scattered all about. And I think that is our calling too, to live as priests and kings in our city today, to build houses and live in them, to build businesses and to enjoy the fruit of them, or join businesses, to marry and be married, or be single, but more importantly, to grow the number of the people of God, to increase in number and not to decrease, and to seek the shalom, the prosperity, the welfare of the city where God placed us. And that's what kings and queens do. They seek the good of the city. They fight the injustices. They advocate for the voiceless. They elevate those on the margins. Now that's what it means to live for God apart from trying to merely introduce people to Jesus. Maybe merely is not the right word, but besides exclusively seeking to introduce people to Jesus and to not run away from him. There's so much more beauty to our work when we remember the first commission that God gave humanity. And so to go back to the question of, should we build more our Christian community, our church, or should we build more our city? And I think to really answer this question, coming from this understanding that God does call us to seek the good of our city, is that the word that God uses for church, and throughout the New Testament, the word that God uses is the ecclesia. Don't trust my pronunciation. But if you look it up, it means assembly. A political assembly, often to make political decisions. Decisions that would affect the entire city. A modern term, I think, for the word would be a city hall or a town hall, where people would gather, sure, to socialize and to catch up, but more importantly, to seek the good of their city. And I think that our church gatherings, our Christian community, exists largely, if not exclusively, for the good of our city. Okay, maybe not exclusively, but largely it exists for the good of our city. That yes, God is developing ourselves, and yes, he's making us individually more and more into the likeness of his Son. But collectively, God calls Christians to gather to seek the good of their city, and not just the gathering. And so to go back to the original question, if I were to ask you, should Christians spend more time in town halls or in building up their town? What would you say? In the same way, Christians should engage less in these, should engage primarily in seeking the good of their city and to gather in order to accomplish that overarching commission, to be fruitful and multiply, to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth and to rule over it. And because we're finite, let's just start with our city. Start with our city and loving our neighbor and our enemies. If this convicted you, if this resonated with you, I urge you to read Jeremiah 29, 1-14, and to just reflect and to pray into these verses, both personally as well as with others. And to continue pressing into the question, what might it look like for me to seek the good of my city? Whether it's Vancouver, Burnaby, Coquitlam, Port Moody, Surrey, Port Alberni, wherever it might be. What might it look for me to pursue the good of my city, my campus, today and in the future, until the Lord returns? And as you pursue that, I guarantee you that you will become tired, of working out in the midst of forces that want to destroy anything good and beautiful about the things you want to build, that you will relish in the community of fellow believers. And as you get recharged and re-equipped in that gathering, in that town hall, in that church, that you'll be refreshed to go back out and to seek the good of our cities again, week in, week out, until Jesus returns. God bless you all.